This is On the Level. I'm Jeff Hutton. Today, the horrific practice of shackling the mentally ill. Tens of thousands are thought to be hidden away from the world in cages or chained to small spaces by their families who are overwhelmed by their needs or owing to the stigma that mental illness can carry. COVID-19 has made a bad situation worse, cutting off access to life-changing medication that paves the way for some to get jobs, reclaim their independence and dignity. But where the pandemic disrupted access to the medication, the shackles have returned. This month, Human Rights Watch published its first worldwide report on the practice. It spans 60 countries. Its author, Kriti Sharma, joined me to discuss the report, and I began by asking what prompted Human Rights Watch to address the issue now. Kriti, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
The report is a follow-up to the 2016 look at shackling. I was wondering, why approach this issue now? I'm curious about the timing of the report.
We launched this new report called Living in Chains ahead of World Mental Health Day. And it's the first time that there has been a global perspective on the issue of shackling. It's a very invisible issue that has been long neglected by governments. And in Indonesia, we find that according to official data, 57,000 people have been shackled at least once in their lives, simply because they have a mental health condition.
57,000. Anyone who lives in Indonesia would know that it's very rare to see anyone with any sort of disabilities. You don't see people really in wheelchairs. You don't see anyone who needs to be cared for. They're very much on the sidelines. It's almost like they're embarrassing. Would you say that that's sort of the mindset?
There's a lot of stigma around disability and mental health. When I started work on Indonesia in 2014, a local activist told me, you can throw a stone anywhere in Java and you will hit someone who is shackled. When I started doing the research, I found that was very much the case. When we traveled into rural areas where there was lack of awareness and people thought that a mental health condition is the result of having sinned or being possessed by evil spirits, we found cases of shackling. And this report, for the very first time, documents how hundreds of thousands of people with mental health conditions are shackled around the world. We find that men, women, children, some as young as 10, are chained or locked in confined spaces for weeks, months, or even years. I interviewed one woman in Indonesia who was crouched in a boarded room for 15 years. And this practice occurs across 60 countries in Asia, Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas. People can spend years chained to a tree, locked in a cage, or even in overcrowded or unsanitary institutions. And why? Because families struggle to cope, and governments are failing to provide adequate support and services, including access to mental health care.
It's a harrowing report. The images are harrowing. The video that goes along with it, it depicts people on a reed mat on the floor, sometimes on a bare concrete floor or dirt floor. There is what looks to be their own feces right beside them. It's positively animalistic in some cases.
Many are forced to eat, sleep, urinate, defecate in small spaces. People who are shackled live in extremely unsanitary and degrading conditions. And UN experts agree. This practice is torture. There is no other word for it. And yet we find thousands living their lives in chains. The radius of their life is as long as the chain, often no longer than 1 to 2 meters square. One man in Bali, Indonesia, his name is Made, told me that he had been locked for 2 years in a cell built on his father's land. He told me, I feel sad locked in this cell. I want to look around outside, go to work, plant rice in the paddy field. Please open the door. But there's pressure from local communities as well. For example, Made's father is being pressured by his neighbors, by his extended family, and even the local police to ensure that Made is locked up. And we see this around the world. The practice is widespread, a brutal practice that occurs across religions, ethnicities, socioeconomic strata, and is really found around the world.
What are some of the illnesses that we're talking about here?
People who are shackled often are not diagnosed with any particular condition. They are there because families think that they are possessed or have had lack of faith or sinned. Some don't even have mental health conditions. Some are just perceived to have them. And there's, the first port of call is spiritual healing. They are taken to traditional or faith healers. And when that doesn't work, they then shackle them out of desperation. I met one family in Bali, Indonesia, that had gone to over 100 faith healers before shackling their relative. So mental health services are not the first port of call for most families. And that is why governments need to pay attention to this issue.
I can almost see a family not knowing what to do and confining someone who's sick for maybe their own protection or others and neglecting them. But what I've seen in your report, it doesn't look like desperation. That it looks like punishment. It looks like there has been a judgment that they have done wrong. If anything, there's almost anger. That's the feeling I have. Am I accurate about that?
I've met countless families around the world where they have told me that this is not something they want to do. I mean, you have to understand, no mother, father, sibling wants to chain their relative. This is a loved one. This is someone that they have grown up with, cared for, loved for many years. They are really pushed to this because there's a lack of support in the community. Governments today are brushing this issue under the carpet. They're not addressing it head on. It's very neglected. Most governments don't have data on the practice. They don't know how many people are shackled or detained, much less the number of institutions. And there's a complete lack of oversight. So, families really do struggle. They do not want to punish relatives. They don't see it as a form of punishment. I have to say, I have met mothers, for example, who have spent, years looking after relatives in shackles, in deep distress themselves, because it's a very disturbing thing to have to do. So I think, the approach really has to be one where we assign responsibility where it should be, which is at the door of the government.
When you do your research and you visit people, how receptive are they to your questions and to your request for access?
I've got unprecedented access across not just homes, but also people living in institutions. Most people don't think that chaining is wrong. They don't see it as a practice that needs to be hidden. In countries like Nigeria, Kenya, it can be an open secret. In Kenya, one man called Paul told me that he had been chained for 5 years. The chain was so heavy. I couldn't understand how he was able to even move. In fact, I heard him walk towards me much before I saw him because the chain would go clink, clink, clink.
Yeah.
And he lived in a tiny room with 7 men, forced to wear no clothes, just underwear. He had to go to the toilet in a bucket. And he told me it's not how a human being is supposed to be. A human being should be free. Now, Paul is part of a church in Kenya where members of the community come in every Sunday, and Paul and 60 other men, women, and children are paraded into the church in chains every Sunday. So the authorities know what happens. Very often it also happens in state-run institutions. And it's an open secret, as I said. It's not something that people are necessarily hiding because they don't see it as doing anything wrong.
I imagine COVID is making a bad situation worse. And have you had a chance to follow up on any of the people you were contacting before for your research?
When you don't have access to the most basic hygiene, whether it be sanitation, soap, basic healthcare, and you are in a confined, congested space, just 1 meter away, chained to someone else, COVID is an extreme risk. We are seeing a trend of people who have been freed going back to chains as a result of the pandemic. In Indonesia, I met a man named Sodikin, whose case I followed for many years. He lives in Cianjur in West Java. He had been locked in a shed by his family for 8 years. He came out of the shed. He was reintegrated into the community. He got support, and he started working at his local factory, stitching buttons onto school uniforms. He did the call to prayer at his local mosque, and he became even the main breadwinner in his family. He was supporting his parents. So his case had really come full circle, and he lived free for 4 years until COVID-19 hit. And government services were disrupted. He lost access to mental health services. And for the past 5 months, his family locked him in a room once again. I just heard that because of an intervention at the local level, Sodikin has been freed once again 2 days ago. But cases like his are becoming increasingly common. And the Indonesian government has acknowledged the impact of the pandemic on this practice.
Is there any evidence at all of progress? I noticed in the report that there are inspections, that there is frequent visits to ensure that there's no shackling.
The Indonesian government has taken a number of very encouraging steps to address the practice of shackling. Firstly, the practice has been banned since 1977. And at multiple times over the years, the government has launched anti-shackling campaigns. What really made a difference is in 2018-19, the government launched a community-based program where it trained health workers and community workers at the grassroots level to go door to door, knocking, collecting information on mental health, connecting data, identifying people who were shackled, freeing them, and also providing basic mental health services. This program has been a success because it has reached 48 million households across the country, which is roughly 70% of the Indonesian population.
Incredible.
However, even programs like this have been suspended because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the case of Sodikin is a direct example of what happens when support is cut off from communities. People go back to chains.
That's heartbreaking. I'm curious, how do you personally cope when you're doing your tours, you're researching, and you're talking to people in cages who are begging to be let out and have no business being there? How do you maintain your balance and your objectivity and keep going?
I've been doing human rights research for 9 years now. And in all my years in this career, documenting the practice of shackling was definitely the most heartbreaking, haunting, and distressing piece of research that I have personally ever done. it's extremely dehumanizing to see people reduced to living in chains. I still remember the case of this woman that I had met in a rural part of Java, and she'd been locked in this room for 15 years. She was so desperate to get out that she had started digging through the cement floor and literally digging her way out. And when the family noticed that she was making progress and may be able to escape, they tied her hands behind her back. They would throw food and she would have to crouch among the rubble to pick out food from, the dust and the dirt on the floor. And that story really stayed with me. If you witness something where, someone's reduced to such a inhumane state, you want to do something about it. Obviously, we do a lot of self-care to ensure that we're resilient and can carry on this work. But for me, I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility to tell these stories, to ensure these voices are heard, not just at the national level, but at the global level, and that we can affect change. But we need your help. We need the help of people around the world to combat stigma. And we encourage you to take our pledge, which is called the hashtag Break the Chains Pledge. You can go to our dedicated website, break-chains.org, and help us put pressure on governments to eradicate this practice. Nobody should be chained in 2020.
Kriti, thank you so much for joining me. I think we'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
And that's the program. Thanks to Kriti Sharma and Human Rights Watch for their time. Our producer is Stephen Handoko. Research by Imam Shofwan. Music by Soundstripe. If you like us, please subscribe and rate us. It helps so much. As always, you can reach us on Instagram at onthelevel_podcast. I'm Jeff Hutton. Bye for now.